Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rhinebeck Historical Society monthly program. Tonight we're very excited to have Ron Gabriele here, who worked for 30 years at Physical Education Department at Columbia Green Community College, was also the Director of Athletics there, and worked for 25 years on various radio stations in the area. I think it was Catskill and Kingston. And so he's going to talk tonight about old-time radio. So here's Ron.
Okay. I'd like to start off the discussion on old-time radio by playing the introduction to one radio show. And then at the end, I'm going to play the introduction to another radio show. Now, I think, and you can hit me with your best shot, but I think these are possibly the two most famous introductions in radio history. Let's see if you agree with me. Okay, we're going to start with this one. Let's see how many remember. Whoop, that goes back one. There it is. No, that's it. Push that button. It takes a minute for that to come on.
General Mills, makers of Cheerios, the oat cereal ready to eat, and Wheaties, breakfast of champions, present the Lone Ranger. A fiery horse with the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty Hi-Yo Silver, the Lone Ranger. With his faithful Indian companion Tonto, the daring and resourceful masked rider of the plains led the fight for law and order in the early western United States. Nowhere in the pages of history can one find a greater champion of justice. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear. From out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of the great horse Silver. The Lone Ranger rides again. Long Silver, let's go, big fella. And Silver, hooray!
Well, what do you think?
Yep.
Yeah. And if that's not the most famous, I'm going to play one at the end that surely has to be. Okay. And I'm curious again to see how many people remember that. Most of us remember this one, obviously.
Oh,
yeah. Anyway, the golden age of radio starts on November the 15th of 1926, a Monday, November 15th, 1926, with the opening of the National Broadcasting Company. The golden age of radio closes on Sunday, September the 30th of 1962, when the CBS radio network cancels the last two dramatic radio programs left on the air. They were yours truly, Johnny Dollar, and this one I know you'll remember, Suspense. They were the last two. Now, the very first radio broadcast in history is made on Christmas Eve of 1906. And it's made from Branch Rock, Massachusetts by this gentleman, Reginald Fessenden. Now, Reginald Fessenden is a Canadian inventor, and he starts out that Yuletide Eve broadcast by playing phonograph records of Christmas songs. Then he plays his violin. Then he sings some Christmas songs. And then finally, he closes out his broadcast by reading passages from the Bible pertaining to the Christmas season. Now, Reginald Fessenden is one of the more amazing men you've never heard of. Later in life, he will help develop sonar, that ping, ping, ping device used out on the high seas to detect the presence of submarines and icebergs. Now, the Titanic disaster in April of 1912 will give added impetus to the development of radio. Meanwhile, at the same time, these amateur ham radio operators are becoming more and more active. And what that does is it kind of keeps radio in front of the public's view. And then the final push for the full development of radio as a broadcast medium is World War I. During the course of the Great War, Allied military commanders come to understand the absolute necessity for wireless voice messaging as opposed to wireless telegraphy in order to effectively coordinate air and ground operations and naval and land operations, something we didn't have. You know, the air and ground, we didn't have that before World War I. So without being able to communicate by voice, how do you know? Even now, we still have friendly fire incidents, right? But if we didn't have that radio, it's not going to work. So that really gave a push to developing radio. Meanwhile, at the same time that World War I is raging, there are remarkable advances in vacuum tube technology. Now, the very first radio sets in history were these primitive little crystal sets, and you needed the earphones to hear the signal. But fairly quickly, it'll be the vacuum tube that becomes the central component of all radio sets, and will remain so until the late 1950s, when what comes into being? Transistors in the late 50s. So vacuum tubes are the central component of the radio sets. The problem is, you had to be a little bit careful with these vacuum tubes. Very sorry to say that on more than one occasion, an American housewife, while doing her house cleaning and listening to her favorite radio show, see, this was the beauty of radio. You could do other things while listening to the radio. But unfortunately, from time to time, that housewife would get a little bit too fastidious. And she would reach into the open back of her radio set to polish off the tops of those vacuum tubes with a damp rag and promptly electrocute herself.
Oh dear, really?
By 1920, radio is ready to burst onto the American scene. On August the 31st of 1920, the first news broadcast in radio history is held over experimental station 8MK out of Detroit. And then comes Tuesday, November the 2nd of 1922. This is the seminal date in radio history. For on that date, November 2nd, 1920, the very first commercial radio station in history signs on the air. Would anyone happen to know the call letters of that most famous station?
KDKA.
KDKA. Is that, were you guys going to say that? KDKA? KDKA out of Pittsburgh. The first commercial broadcasting station in history. At 96 years and counting, KDKA is going stronger than ever. Still broadcasting, and inside the radio industry, some folks would call KDKA a blowtorch station. Now, a blowtorch station is simply a station that, one, leads its market in the ratings, two, operates at the maximum available power of 50,000 watts, and in a very few cases has a clear channel. That is, there's no other stations on its frequency. That kind of a station will send its signal a long way in the daytime and extraordinary distances at night. Now, my mom often talked about growing up in a very poor immigrant Italian family in the Kankakee section of Kingston. Anybody familiar with Kankakee? Okay. Well, she had 6 brothers and 1 sister. The 6 brothers, my uncles, grew up to operate the Ambrose Brothers Luncheonette on Broadway in Kingston, right near Kingston City Hospital. Anybody possibly remember that? They made tremendously delicious ice cream, 12% butterfat. No wonder I had a heart attack in 2007. I used to eat that ice cream like crazy. Anyway, the family was very poor. Grandpa Ambrose was a gardener for a very wealthy woman, Mrs. Quartz, on the Quartz estate. Her husband was a state assemblyman in Kankakee. And if I'm not mistaken, I haven't been in Kankakee recently, but the last time I was there was still a volunteer fire company, Quartz Hose. Still there? Okay, so as poor as the family was, however, Grandpa Ambrose understood my mom's love for radio. This stuff must be genetic. And he managed to scrape together the few pennies necessary to buy for her one of those primitive little crystal sets. So every night, after supper, as they called it then, the family gathered around in the parlor, as they called it then, and they chatted, read, or snoozed. Mom would take her little crystal set, go up into the corner, and she said, night after night after night, I tried to pick up the signal of KDKA. And night after night after night, I couldn't get it. And finally comes the night she said, I got KDKA. I jumped up, I ripped off my headphones, she said, and I yelled at the family, I got KDKA! I got KDKA! And Grandpa Ambrose, bless his soul, fresh off the boat from Italy, with great anxiety in his voice, goes, Catherine, keep your voice down. They'll hear you on the other end. By 1922 then, the first of the entertainment programs are coming on the air. March 10th, 1922. The great newspaper of the entertainment industry. Anybody know the name of it? Variety. Variety has a headline that screams, radio sweeping the nation. Over 1 million sets in use. Now, this is significant on a couple of levels. Number one, it's less than 2 years since that first station, KDKA, came on. Number two, at that time in our history, believe it or not, we had less than 100 million Americans. No 320 million Americans like today. We are proliferating like rabbits. So what this speaks to is this dramatic cultural impact that radio has, that it grows this quickly on such a large percent of the available population. The impact forgotten today. Am I wrong? Today, the young people, particularly with their handheld devices, with their tweets and Twitters and whatever, I don't even know what they are, they wouldn't even consider a time, imagine, when there was no radio, nothing, silence, okay? And so now here comes this magic box in the kitchen, in the living room, changes everything. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that in a little while. January 1st, 1923, the very first radio Rose Bowl broadcast is held over station KHJ in Los Angeles. Now, take a minute and let's examine how radio stations got their call signs. As early as 1912, an international conference was held, and it was entitled International Radio Telegraphs. At that conference, the attending nations are awarded the first letter that they must use in the call signs of all radio stations in those respective nations. So, Britain, for instance, receives the B. All radio stations in Britain must begin their call sign with the B, such as the very famous BBC. France receives the F. All radio stations in France begin their call sign with the F. Canada gets the C. Mexico gets S. And I tricked you. Boy, did I lead you into a trap. Mexico got the X. Now, at first thought, you might X. But if you think about it, I can't think of too many countries in the world that have an X in their name. The only other one I can think of is Luxembourg. Can I be missing any? So Mexico, to this day, stations begin with an X. Now, the United States, meanwhile, we get 4 letters. We get the A, we get the N, we get the W, and we get the K. Now, quickly, the A and the N are reserved for military and emergency broadcast frequencies. The W and the K are reserved for commercial broadcast stations. And so for the next several years, right until 1928, as new stations came on the air, they were free to pick and choose. Do they want to start their letters with a W or a K? They could choose. 1928, the Federal Radio Commission, or the FRC, predecessor to today's dreaded FCC. Yeah. The FRC makes 2 very important rulings. Ruling number 1, the FRC says, from this date forward, 1928, all new radio stations coming on the air west of the Mississippi River must start their call sign with the K. And all radio stations, new stations coming on the air east of the Mississippi, must start their call sign with the W. However, they go a step further and they grandfather in the existing stations by stating all radio stations currently on the air, if they so choose, may keep whatever call sign they have. And they did so choose. So it is, to this day, we have 11 radio stations west of the Mississippi that begin their call sign with a W, and we have 10 radio stations east of the Mississippi that begin their call sign with the K. The most famous of the W stations out west has to be radio station WACO in Waco, Texas. How cool is that? And of course, the most famous of the K stations in the east has to be KDKA. Okay? Now, they make a second ruling. In the second ruling, the FRC states, from this date forward, all new radio stations coming on the air are no longer free to pick and choose whether they want 3 or 4 letters in their call sign, as you have been doing. Starting on this date, all new stations coming on the air must have 4 letters in your call sign. But again, they take a step further and they grandfather existing stations by stating all 3-letter stations already on the air, if you choose, you may keep your 3-letter call sign. And again, they did so choose. And so locally here, we have a 3-letter station in Schenectady, WGY. WGY comes on the air February the 20th of 1922 at 7:47 in the evening. The first announcer and program director is a man named Colin Hager, spelled K-O-L-I-N, kind of an unusual spelling. Colin Hager comes on the air and he says, folks, I want to give you the meaning of WGY. The W stands for wireless. The G is the first letter of the company that owns WGY, General Electric, GE. And the Y is the last letter in the home city of Schenectady, WGY. Now, as Arlene and I, this is my wife Arlene, I'm sorry, I was remiss, I didn't introduce her. God bless her, 52 years she's put up with me. But as we travel around the country, we both love radio, but fortunately she loves old westerns. We have, thank God, we have similar interests. And so I try to tune in stations in cities. I want to see what's going on, I want to hear the stations. If you do that, as you travel around the country, and if you tune in, and if you pick up a radio station in some city around the land that has only 3 letters, of this you can be sure. That station will have had to come on the air sometime between 1920 and 1928. Can be no other way. Okay? Now, 1926 then, as I suggested, November 15th of 26 is the opening of the golden age of radio. We had radio, and now comes the golden age. Now, what is the golden age? Basically, as most of you know, the golden age of radio is similar to what TV is today, right? We turn the dial, and every half hour or hour, there were all kinds of, a huge kaleidoscope of shows, remember? You had comedies, you had quiz shows, you had weather, you had news, you had music, dramas, you had crime shows. I mean, the list is endless. And westerns, on and on and on. All of that is possible, the golden age, only because of the coming of the networks. Why? Well, because only a corporate entity, a large corporate entity, like a network, would have the financial wherewithal to fund 7 days a week of programs. Think about it. One poor little individual station couldn't even put on one night show, much less 7 days. So it's the coming of the networks that opens the door and brings on what we call the golden age. And so many of us look back so fondly on those days. They were beautiful days. All right, so November 15th, 1926, here comes NBC. They start with a network of 18 radio stations along the line. And they call it the NBC Red Network. 6 weeks later, NBC brings forth a second network. This one's only got That's it. He's got it. This one's only got 5 stations, and it is the NBC. Thanks. Somebody else got it. The NBC Blue Network. So now NBC has the red network and they have the blue network. Now, January 21st, 1927. Pretty quick. Here comes the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS. And that begins an arch rivalry, bitter, tooth and nail, life and death, day in and day out struggle, boom, 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 with each other, right down to today in television. Right now, every day, every single day, those two networks fight it out for every point of the Nielsen ratings and every sponsor's dollar. You couldn't have a bigger rivalry than those two. The third of the big 4 networks comes on the air in 1934 when 4 independent radio stations around the country get together and they form the Mutual Broadcasting System. Remember Mutual? MBS, Mutual Broadcasting System. Now, Mutual's interesting. Mutual has kind of a checkered history. They have pluses, they have minuses. Mutual is the only one of the big 4, NBC, CBS, Mutual, and ABC are the big 4. Mutual is the only one that never owned any of its radio stations along the line. To this day, to now, NBC, ABC, CBS own a few of their own radio stations. Mutual never did. Okay, on the plus side, Mutual, at times, was the largest of the 4 networks. That is, at times, Mutual had the most stations across the United States carrying its shows. Mutual would also have the distinction of carrying some of the most beloved and famous radio shows in history. They carried The Lone Ranger for about the first half of its run until it flipped over to ABC in the mid-40s. They carried The Shadow for all of its run. They carried Tom Mix and his Ralston Straight Shooters. They carried Straight Arrow. They carried Superman, Captain Midnight. They carried a ton of shows. Lastly, on the plus side, Mutual got a very big jump on the sports audience. We've got any sports fans in here? And you're going to know what I'm talking about here in a minute. They did something kind of neat. Mutual, in the summer months, carried the Mutual baseball game of the day. They went all around America. They went to a different major league city every day and broadcast the game from that city. So one day they might be in St. Louis carrying the Cardinals game. Next day they're in Detroit carrying the Tigers game. Next day they're in Boston carrying a Red Sox game. Now, why was this so important? Now, here we go. If I have some real sports fans, I'm going to get some head shaking, yes, I hope. Baseball in those days was the sport. I mean, think about it. It was truly the national pastime. The NBA, the NFL, the NHL, even if people knew what those were, okay, those are like minor diversions that you paid attention to when baseball wasn't being played. But baseball was it. So by Mutual carrying that game of the day, they got a big jump on the sports audience. Now, in terms of sports in the early days, the other 2 biggies, tell me if you disagree, the other 2 biggies were college football, had a lot of college football radio, and heavyweight boxing matches. Yeah. They were pretty big. They were pretty big. But baseball, particularly the World Series, was by far the biggest. On the negative side, Mutual at times was in and out of financial trouble. At one point they reorganized into something called the Don Lee Mutual Network. And lastly, on the negative side, think about it. Mutual is the only network of the big 4 that did not make it into television. We have NBC, we have CBS, we have ABC. There is not now and has never been a Mutual Broadcasting Network on TV. The ABC network is the 4th and final of the big 4 networks. It comes on the air in 1945, fairly late in the game. And it comes on the air under circumstances that were a little difficult to understand then and now. In the early 1940s, the federal government, in its infinite wisdom, got it into its mind that NBC had a monopoly because they owned the red network and the blue network. Now, as I suggested, people then and now could not understand how NBC had this monopoly when they had this tremendous competitor in CBS alone and a strong competitor in Mutual. But be that as it may, government will have its way, and the federal government forced them to sell off the Blue Network. And that's how ABC came into being. All right. Now, I want to go back for a moment to this cultural impact. Consider, if you will, before 1920, before the birth of commercial radio, there is basically, and give me your best argument, but there's basically no such thing as in-home entertainment. If you wanted to see a movie, an opera, a play, vaudeville, you had to go out of your home to the theater, to the Grange Hall, to the auditorium, to the high school gym, whatever. You had to go out of your home for that. You wanted to see a ball game, you had to go out of your home to go to the ballpark. You wanted to see the carnival, the circus, your Chautauqua show, you had to go out of your home, you see. Now, think about this. Here's home. Right now, starting in 1920, there's this magic box in the living room or kitchen, and the whole world comes into the comfort, warmth, and security of your home. You don't have to leave home. Can you imagine? The impact is massive, and nobody writes about this. There's a great book there. Some enterprising young author, there's a great book there about, the impact and some of the things that happened with the coming of radio. Now, 1886, a great German physicist named Heinrich Hertz discovers the existence of electromagnetic waves, invisible waves all around us in this room, traveling at the speed of light. In 1894, the year of Hertz's death, English physicist and college professor Dr. Oliver Lodge demonstrates the ability to send impulses, or if you will, messages on those electromagnetic waves. He humpbacks messages on the waves. How does he do it? He does it by means of a show. He goes all over England, and he has a great big large bottle, a huge bottle, and he fills it with these minute magnetic metal filings. Okay? And he puts the bottle on the table. Now he introduces an electric spark that magnetizes the particles. Now he introduces a loud blue spark. Bang! And that spark sends impulses across the stage, invisible, and lights a lamp on the other end of the stage. This is 1894. Every single time out, the applause is thunderous. People are, wow, they've never seen anything like this. Okay? Lodge is onto something, folks. If he would have stayed with this, Oliver Lodge today would be known as the father of radio instead of Guglielmo Marconi. Okay? But Lodge, just like every one of us in this room, I think, now I'll speak for me, I'm going to say I think, every one of us has a weakness. We all have a weakness. My particular weakness is potato chips and ice cream. Never saw a potato chip I didn't like. And not too much ice cream I didn't like. Well, Lodge, his weakness is, you ready for this? Ghosts. Ghosts. The man gets hung up on ghosts. He gets like crazy. And you know what, in a perverted way, if you will, bad word, the fact that he's done something with his electromagnetic waves convinces him even more. Well, if there's these electromagnetic waves, there must be ghosts. And so the poor man drops his pursuit of electromagnetic wave theory and spends the rest of his life literally chasing ghosts. He goes to seances. He visits mediums. He interviews people who have claimed to have had encounters with ghosts. He drops the ball and opens the door for Marconi. And as if that isn't bad enough, Marconi, this Italian, moves from Italy to England. He makes England his base of, I might talk about rubbing his nose in the dirt. He makes England his base of operations. Now, it will not be easy. It takes Marconi more than a decade to be able to send wireless telegraph messages across the Atlantic from England to Nova Scotia. I mean, it's a lot of work. And it's described in this tremendous book, Thunderstruck. And this author, Eric Larson, is some author. I read this thing, and I kept having to go to the back. and going, is there a bibliography? Is this true? It reads like a novel. It's so exciting, so good. I went out and bought all his books. I've got everything he wrote because it's so good. Anyway, in this particular book, I got mine on Amazon, Thunderstruck. It's a story of Marconi developing his wireless telegraphy. At the same time, it's a story of Dr. Harvey Crippen, a physician in England who murders his wife and chops her up and buries her in the cellar. And then he tries to escape on a ship. And Marconi's telegraph, wireless telegraph, beats his ship to the United States. And that's how he gets arrested, brought back to England, and they hang him. But it's, I mean, if you want a great book, I would highly recommend Thunderstruck. This is great. So, okay, so Marconi gets credit today for being the father of radio because Lodge basically drops the ball. The earliest TV sets come into homes around 1949, early 50. Here's the problem. There's not a lot of them. But here's what everybody forgets. There's no TV stations. There's very few stations to broadcast programs. And I'm going to illustrate this point by telling you this story. I'm from Athens. I was born in Kingston, grew up in Athens. Okay? In those days, we walked to school, neighborhood schools. There were very few school buses. Went to school in the morning. At noon, walked home. There's no cafeteria, no gym, no Greek counselor, nothing. Are you kidding me? We didn't even have a janitor. 3 teachers, 3 rooms, 3 teachers. That was it. So we walked home at noon. Then at 1 o'clock, Mr. Johnson rang the bell, we walked back. 3 o'clock, rang the bell, we walked home. Okay? All right. One beautiful spring day in 1950, I walk home from school. And on my block, there's the next block down is a family, the Destadios. We're almost all Italians in the upper village of Athens. Almost all Italians. There's one guy, Murphy. How did he get in there?
He burned it.
All Italian. All Italian. And we were related to half of Glasgow and Kingston. Okay? We used to say, don't say anything bad about an Italian in Athens, Kingston, or Glasgow, because we're all related. But anyway, so I walked home, and my mom gives me permission to walk down the block, the next block down, to the Destadios of Elvie and Benny Destadios. They're the first people in the neighborhood with TV. There I am, 3:30 on this beautiful April afternoon in 1950, sitting in their living room watching television. It was amazing. I never saw anything like it. I'm watching this picture, this TV. It was stunning. Do you know what I was watching? No, I was watching a test pattern. There was an Indian's head on it. And you know what the sign on the screen said? Next show at 5 p.m. And I would sit there for that hour and a half. Are you kidding me? There was not enough TV stations to see. Okay, so if you'll accept, would you agree with me then, roughly 1952? That means it's 32 years since radio came into being. So what I'm suggesting to you is, yes, the visual component of television is tremendous. No, I won't argue. Being able to see, perfect. But the idea of in-home entertainment, sitting in your home, and the safety, comfort, warmth, and being entertained is 32 years old when TV comes along. That's my point. So the coming of radio, the impact is incredible. And one last note on Marconi. I can't let go without telling you this story. He dies in 1937. His funeral begins at 6 p.m., July the 21st of 1937. At 6 p.m., telegraphers the world over stopped sending telegraph messages for 2 minutes in respect to Marconi. So the great hush prevailed for 2 minutes in 1937, probably for the last time in history. Isn't that something? Marconi. Okay, so now we got the networks coming in. The networks quickly figure out the market. I mean, they have to make money to survive. Every business does, right? They have to make money to survive. Okay, so they figure out the way to satisfy audiences is to appeal to different segments of the audience in different time slots. It was called time slotting. And the first time slot of the day is early afternoon, and it's roughly from 12:30 in the afternoon until about roughly 3:30. And this slot is aimed at housewives. Okay. And I think some of you already got what's coming up here. The theory is the producers are thinking, okay, the kids are going back to school, and Mom's got a couple hours yet before she has to prepare supper, and maybe she can take an hour or so to sit down and listen to her favorite soap opera. They were technically called daytime serials, but they commonly became known as soap operas because why? Almost every one of them was sponsored by a soap or detergent company, Rinso, and so on. You can almost remember the jingles, you know. Okay. Yeah. The first soap opera comes on the air July 31st of 1930. It's entitled Clara, Lou, L-U, and M-E-M. And it comes on the air on a Chicago radio station, WGN. Now, at that time, WGN is owned by a great newspaper, the Chicago Tribune. And so WGN stood for World's Greatest Newspaper. WGN. Okay? Now, I wish I had time to go into some of these other symbols for you. But anyway, many other soap operas would follow. How many can we name? How many soap operas from radio? Can anybody remember? Ma Perkins?
Yes.
What else? I'm thinking of Just Plain Bill, John's Other Wife, As the World Turns.
Oh, As the World Turns. Yes, I definitely remember
Days
that.
of Our Lives.
Yes.
And the iconic, to me, the iconic serial of all time on radio had to be The Guiding Light.
Right. Yes, yes.
Okay. So, that's the first time segment of the day. Now, the next segment that the networks aim for is the after-school segment from about 3:30 till about 6 o'clock. The idea here is the kids are home from school, but they're not ready to sit down for supper yet. And so they aim their programs at the kids. Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay. They aim all sorts of programs at the children. Okay? And these could be 15 minutes, 3 days a week. They could be a half hour. And also, by the way, they did do some kiddie shows on weekends. There would be shows that they did weekends, but during the week, 3:30 to about 6 was when they did the kiddie shows. Now, almost all of these kiddie shows are sponsored by cereal companies. Okay? The one famous exception was Captain Midnight.
Ovaltine.
Yes, sir, Captain Midnight. Good for you. Nobody gets it. Ovaltine. Ovaltine. Yes, sir. Boy, was he, even on TV, he was Ovaltine. Okay, now, the cereal companies would have this thing going on, these premiums. If you would send in 3 box tops and 10 cents, you would get your secret decoder badge, or your secret decoder ring, or your secret decoder patch, or whatever it was. And it was, remember, it was just me and Tom Mix. Nobody else knew. It was just Captain Midnight me. And so I got my decoder ring out. We're going to track down those bad guys. We're going to help Tom Mix. And I mean, this stuff kept coming out, but you had to have it. You had to have it. Whatever it was, you had to have it. And arguably, one of the most famous, back to Tom Mix here, one of the most famous of these premiums, they call them, was the Tom Mix Whistling Sheriff's Badge. Now this was something, boy. You wore this badge. You went around with your guns on, and you were the sheriff. However, if you got yourself in trouble, if the bad guys were surrounding you, you took the badge off and blew a whistle. And Tom Mix and Tony were going to ride up and save you. And today on the collectible market, you know, these things are worth a few bucks. Did you also, how many of you knew, I bet you didn't know, in Lassie, Rin Tin Tin had their own radio shows.
Yes.
They were more on the weekends, but they had their own, and they actually
That's
had
the first movie I saw.
the real dog actually doing the barks and whining and all of that on these radio shows. All right, 2 more segments. The next segment is the after dinner hour segment from about 6:30 until about 8 o'clock. Now, in this segment, the networks were aiming programs at the mixed audience. This was tricky business. This was tricky. They had to come up with programs that would appeal to the youngsters and the adult. So the stories had to have enough content, enough intricate plot, enough good sound effects, good music, good acting to keep the adult interested. Meanwhile, it couldn't be over the head of the kid. It had, the child had to be able to understand. Tricky business. And it was, that segment was hard to have many winners. But there was, folks, one winner in that segment. And this show was on for 22 consecutive years.
One man.
He said for McGee and Molly. We're going to get to them in the adult segment. They come later. Okay. This show, you're gonna know this in a minute. This show is on 7:30, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Lone Ranger.
The Lone Ranger.
Yep.
Perfect. The Lone Ranger hits the mark perfectly. He is. It's unbelievable. Now, today in television, the ratings company is Nielsen, right? In the days of radio, the ratings company was the C.E. Hooper Company. Okay. Today on television, a TV show lives or dies by its ratings, right? They're calling you, Mrs. So-and-so, are you listening? What are you looking at right now? So you tell them that, and they write this all down. Now, networks go to the sponsor and say, look at this. In our time slot, we got, blah, blah. And that's how the sponsor buys the program. But if they don't have enough people watching or listening, they can't sell the show. So what happens? Show's off the air. Same thing on radio. The Hoopers. They did Hoopers, okay? The C.E. Hooper Company, year after year after year, for 22 consecutive years, from 1933 till 1955, found that right on the money, 50% of the Lone Ranger's audience was adults and 50% was child. Now, in our jaded, sophisticated age, we're tempted to think of this as a juvenile show. We'd be wrong. Arlene and I have a number of these shows in our collection. By the way, I got a couple of catalogs here. They're free. Anybody wants some extras that I get nothing from this, but we buy our shows from this outfit. They got all kinds of. Please feel free to take them. But anyway, we have these in our collection, and we'll probably listen to one going home tonight. They're tremendous. They're very good shows. They're just right, just for the adult and for the child. So the Lone Ranger. Now, we move into the adult segment. From 8 o'clock till about 10:30, now the programming is aimed at adults. Now, before I take a step further, we need to clear this up, this word adult, right? What does adult mean today? Filthy. Somebody's shaking their head. Exactly. God bless you. I'm thinking the same thing, except I couldn't express it as good as you did. Filthy. I mean, Arlene and I love movies. If we could only find good, we'd go to movies a lot. But every other word has to be an F-bomb in the movies. Their mamas didn't wash their mouths out with soap enough. My God, what is it? We couldn't use that language in the locker room when I was a kid. And you never, am I right? You used that word to a girl? Ooh, boy, you didn't, and girls never use that language. Today, stand in any school, listen to the girls come down the hall. You want to hear something, squirt your ears. But anyway, adult today means filthy. Folks, as you know, adult then didn't mean that at all. All it meant was the shows would probably be above the interest level of the child. The plot might be a little too intricate. It just might, there were some crime shows where there were adult situations where a woman was running around her husband and her boyfriend decided to bump off the husband, and then the detective solves it. But you know what? It was handled in a way that the child it would not be offensive. The child probably couldn't even understand what was going on. Just they're bad guys, something like that. But, I mean, so there was never anything. So when I'm talking adult, I'm just talking a level above the interest of the child. And the number one kind of program in the adult segment, anybody want to take a guess?
Variety,
Now, you're right, you're on the right track.
variety show?
Well,
A variety show?
close, very close. He says Amos and Andy, which was one of the most popular shows from the late 1920s until right up to TV. But I was hoping to get the answer. Well, here we go. You guys are on it. Comedies. I'm looking for the general kind of show. Fibber, McGee and Molly. So comedies, Red Skelton, these were the #1 kind of show on radio. Now, one of the reasons for this, not the whole reason, but one of the reasons, there was something before radio called vaudeville. Now, vaudeville, basically in a nutshell, don't want to get too deep, but it was just a number of acts. I mean, there were so many different vaudeville troupes, and they went all over the country, big towns, small towns, and there were a series of unrelated acts, where for 2 hours, on the stage comes a comedian, blah, blah, blah. On the stage comes a musician. On the stage comes an acrobat. Here comes a magician. Here comes another comedian, you know. And this went on all night long. Well, the #1 talent in vaudeville was comedians. So radio rated vaudeville shamelessly. They took all the best comedians. And I'm going to, go ahead.
Jack Benny.
Oh, you took my notes. I was going to, I don't know if everybody's going to agree with me. I wanted to suggest to you, I think the #1 comedian in radio history was Jack Benny. I think so. And there's Mary Livingstone. I should know that guy, but I don't. But Mary Livingstone, his wife. She wasn't his wife on the air, but in real life she was.
Don Amici.
That is Don Amici. Thank you. That is Don Amici. Okay. So on Jack Benny, I'm arguing that I think he was the #1 comedian in radio. Anybody disagree? And Red Skelton was great. I mean, so many of the other.
So many.
There were. You're right. But can I ask you a question? How old was Jack Benny?
39.
And when he got older, how old was he?
39.
He never got older than 39. And he had this bit with his wife, or well, she wasn't his wife on radio, Maryland, that he was cheap, right? I mean, they played up, he was very cheap. You know, in real life, Jack Benny was a very warm, giving, generous man. But on radio, they played his so-called cheapness to the hilt. One of the most famous skits in radio history. Some of you know it. Jack Benny's walking down the streets of New York City. A robber jumps out from behind a building, out of an alley. He's got a gun, and he says to Jack Benny, "Your money or your life?" Silence. Silence. Finally, the robber says, "I said, your money or your life." And Jack Benny finally says, I'm thinking.
That's like one of the longest silences in radio.
Yes.
Minutes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. He had a automobile. Anybody possibly remember what it was? 1929 Maxwell. He had this gravelly voiced valet.
Oh, yeah.
Rochester. He had this whole troupe. Who was that band leader? He had a wonderful band leader with him.
Phil Harris.
Phil Harris, thank you. Yep. So, I don't know. As they say, everybody has their favorites. How about Red Skelton?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so Red Skelton. And how could we forget George Burns and Gracie Allen?
Yeah.
I don't have a picture of Fibber, McGee, and Molly, but they were Wistful Vista. They lasted forever. Fred
Allen.
Now, what was the bit with Fred Allen? You remember him and Benny were supposed to be
Rivals. Yes.
How about, can I suggest another one? Edgar Bergen and... one more. Abbott Costello.
Yeah.
What did you say?
Miss Brooks.
Miss Brooks. And she went over to TV.
Yes.
Yep.
She went over to TV. Okay. So, comedy shows were the #1. But, again, we had dramas, we had detective shows, we had crime shows. The Shadow.
Only the shadow.
Oh, who knows? Only the Shadow knows. We had Dragnet. Jack Webb. Remember Jack Webb? And of course, that became huge on TV. Okay. I'll name a few others. Sam Spade Detective, The Green Hornet, Boston Blackie. How about the Thin Man, the Fat Man? Who else? The Shadow. Yeah. Any others? Can you think of any others? I mean, there were so.
The FBI.
Yeah. Oh, yes. The FBI in Peace and War. Okay. There were these anthology thriller shows called Escape, Suspense, The Whistler, The Mysterious Rider. I mean, it was just so many. Yeah.
Inner Sanctum.
That
was
the
terrible.
creaking door.
That was absolutely terrible.
Oh my! Yeah, you wanted to hear that. You wanted somebody else with you, right? That wasn't a good one to be alone. You know that you wanted somebody. You didn't want to be alone on a
Dimension X.
Dimension X. Yeah. There were only 2 science fiction shows on radio. One was Dimension X, and I forget what the other one was.
X-1.
That's it, X minus 1 and Dimension X, thank you, those are the two. Okay, now, there were two shows that were very different from other shows. They were called the Lux Radio Theater and the Screen Guild Playhouse. Now what these two shows did, they went to Hollywood and they bought the rights to the script of a recent hit movie. And they then hired the actors that starred in the movie and had them act in front of a live radio audience. It was terrific. And so for years and years and years, Lux Radio Theater was moderated, the moderator was a wonderful director in Hollywood, very famous director. When I say the name, you'll know it. Cecil B. DeMille. Yep, he lasted for years on that. And then, I can't let it go without talking about CBS Radio Playhouse and Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater of the Air. And this was a wonderful actor. He played the Shadow. He was the first Shadow. Okay, he lasted 1 year as a Shadow. But more famous was the Mercury Theater of the Air. And I'm sure everybody here remembers Halloween Eve, 1938, H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. And it's done like a news broadcast. They did it like a news broadcast. In fact, folks, if you're interested, again, I got this from Amazon. In the 70s, there was a television movie called The Night That Panicked America. We finally got it. We bought it in 1998. We bought it about a year ago. We watch it on each Halloween. And it's the story of H.G. And what's neat is, Orson Welles, as you said, what's neat is it shows how they make the sound effects. It's very, very interesting. The Night That Panicked America. Okay, it's a TV movie. But anyway, Orson Welles, so he puts on this drama, and he scares the bejabbers out of half the American public. Half of the American public thought the Martians had really landed at Grover's Mill, New Jersey. I mean, it was scared. People were ready to commit suicide. It was horrible. Half the public was like panicked when they found out. And this is what we live in the greatest country on earth. God, I love this country. We're pretty good most of the time. You know, when things happen, we seem to come back pretty good. I don't know, after this last election, people have lost their minds, but pretty much most of the time, we bounce back pretty good, okay? So most Americans were a little embarrassed, but that was the end of it. Now, I have a story for you. I don't remember the exact name, but there was a banana republic in South America. A couple of years later, after 38, they played War of the Worlds down there. Same thing. They scared the bejabbers out of half the public of that country. They weren't like Americans, though. Didn't bounce back well from it. When they found out it was a radio play, folks, true story, a mob of them went to the radio station, nailed the doors shut, nailed plywood over the windows, and burned the station to the ground with the people in it.
Oh my heavens.
Yeah, true story.
He was at my college.
Yeah, Orson Welles.
Yes.
What a wonderful actor. I mean, the guy was just tremendous.
But
And
people did die in this country as a result of that radio station.
okay, of that War of the Worlds.
War of the Worlds.
Is that right?
Yes.
They killed themselves or had accidents?
There were accidents. Actually, were I believe two. I'm not sure of the number, but I think there were two gun accidents. Someone was coming out of the woods,
Yeah.
and they thought that was it, and they shot them.
They thought these were the
They
Martians.
thought they were the Martians.
That was scary. And then in this Night That Panicked America, the movie, it ends, I mean, the movie's done beautifully, very well. It ends with the following. It says, unfortunately, Americans would have an all too real nightmare to deal with very shortly. And in the background, you hear the voice of Hitler getting louder and louder, you know. Yeah. But anyway, okay, so Westerns. We had Straight Arrow. We had the Roy Rogers Show. We had the Hopalong Cassidy Show. Gene Autry started a show called Melody Ranch,
Right.
sponsored by Spearmint Gum. Wrigley's Spearmint Gum, healthful and delicious. We had the Six Shooter, Jimmy Stewart. Okay, and last but not least, we had Gunsmoke. And folks, I do a separate speech in which actually 3 separate speeches in which I talk about the history of 2 shows, 2 shows, and 2 shows. And in one of them, I talk about Gunsmoke. Believe it or not, there are radio historians that consider Gunsmoke as the finest dramatic show in radio history. Did you hear what I said? I didn't say Western. These historians consider it the finest dramatic show in history. It was tremendous, tremendous. We have a bunch of those in our collection, and I could listen to them over and over and over. They were just tremendous. Okay, finally, we have, as the 50s came around, I don't know if you should say most, a good number of radio shows migrate to television. Armis Brooks, I mean, there was tons and tons of them went to TV. Trivia question. I got a great trivia question for you. Did you know there is one show in history, and it's a Western. It starts on TV and migrates backwards to radio. Now, it doesn't go off TV, but it was so good on TV that the producers decided to go to CBS and see, how about putting it on radio? So they did. Well, anybody want to take a shot at the name of it?
Rawhide?
Rawhide, close.
Go name Paladin.
Paladin, that's it. Have Gun Will Travel. Richard Boone on TV, John Dana. You're good. You should be up here giving the speech. She's good. Nobody ever gets that right. You're the first person that ever got that right. Have Gun Will Travel. That's great. That's great. Okay. Lastly, in 1947, to just give you an idea how popular was radio in the Golden Age. 1947, folks, is a little late in the game on radio, but it's not too late. There's still no TV in 47. By 47, you could see, you can get an idea it was coming, but radio was still king. In the year of 1947, the C.E. Hooper Company continues to do its ratings. They have to. That's how they make their living. But they said in that year, you know what? Let's find out how many Americans are regular radio listeners. And they did a survey in 1947, and they came up with the astonishing figure that 82 out of every 100 Americans was a regular radio listener during the Golden Age. And radio was definitely king. And I want to thank you for allowing me to share my love of radio with you. And if there's any questions, I would be glad to answer them. And if you know of any group that wants to have a speaker, this is my hobby, no charge. I love to go around on my retirement days and speak about different topics. So if you know somebody, I have sheets with my phone number and so on and so forth. And please help yourself to these catalogs. Okay. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I almost forgot. Tell me if you disagree. If the Lone Ranger wasn't the most famous, then this one had to be. Let's see what you think.
Shadows.
Yeah.
Shadows.
Remember this?
Sunday afternoon.
Adventures of the Shadow are on the air. Brought to you each week at this time by your neighborhood Blue Coal dealer.
Remember that? Blue Coal?
These dramatizations are designed to demonstrate fortunately to old and young alike that crime does not pay.
Well, what do you think? If the Lone Ranger wasn't the most famous, the Shadow had. Okay, yes, sir.
Walter Gibson, who
Yes.
was the creator of the Shadow,
Yep.
lived in Eddyville.
Yes.
He was a member of the Poughkeepsie Magicians Club before he passed on in the 80s.
I didn't know that, but I knew he was from somewhere in the Kingston area here.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's real interesting. But for those of you who want to remember, the Lone Ranger, when you bought Cheerios cereal,
Yes.
on the back of the box were the villages pertaining to the stories, and you could cut them out and assemble them.
I think I have some.
I remember that.
My favorite show after school was Jack Armstrong, All American Boy.
Yes.
And it was sponsored by Pep Cereal, P-E-P
Hello,
Cereal.
Pep.
And you could send away for kits of airplanes, fighter planes, which you had to cut out and assemble
Yeah.
by sending box tops
Yeah.
to
Jack
the
Armstrong,
show.
All American Boy.
And the other show was, I have two sisters, we faithfully listened to Let's Pretend every Saturday morning. It was a wonderful show about fairy tales.
There, yeah. Can I ask you this? What high school did Jack Armstrong, All American Boy, go to? Hudson High School. She's good. You are good. She's great.
They're from Wappingers, and they do radio. They talk about radio.
Yeah,
I walked in with them.
Oh, they're great. You're great.
Yeah, I should say that my husband broadcasts the radio shows Sunday nights on WBKR from 6 to 9.
91.3
And
FM.
that's how I know all this.
So everything I said you already knew.
Oh, yeah. I
That's
might not
great.
remember, but
That's great. Well, you were so nice to let me go blab on. That's nice. Go ahead.
it's a lot of
So
fun.
something I learned, I'm a little younger than you, so I missed most of that, but I was always interested in it. And some of the variety shows, just as in the early days of television, would have summer replacements.
Yes.
And my wife's father, who I never met, was a fairly well-known character actor named Lionel Stander, and he appeared on the Danny Kaye show, which was a summer replacement, I think, for Fred Allen, and he had a repertoire that included Lionel Stander and Eve Arden. I've listened to some of
Miss
those.
Armis Brooks.
And Lionel Stander later was the original Riley, in Life of Riley.
Is that right?
Before William Bendix took over.
Do you remember Armis Brooks, who her boyfriend, who she wanted to be her boyfriend was? Did anybody remember? It was he became a great movie actor named
Mr.
Jeff
Boynton.
Chandler. Yeah, Mr. Boynton, and he was played by Jeff Chandler.
Jeff Chandler.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sure a lot of other people feel this way too. The great thing about radio was using your imagination,
Huh?
which we lost a lot of.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, today,
making
You can
so
do something else at the same time.
interesting.
You know, scrub the
My
walls or
husband
something.
remembered that he didn't like the television version of The Lone Ranger as well as he liked
I
the
agree.
radio
I
one.
agree.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I met Fred Foy. I
Oh.
have his picture.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
and,
the
you know,
announcer.
when he told me what was going to happen.
Oh,
and
you
the
met
sound
him?
effects.
You did
Oh
meet him?
yeah, I go to the old conventions.
Now, he used to appear at college campuses, Fred Foy. He was the announcer. He was the guy you heard say, and they said he couldn't get away without having to do that. He had to do that wherever he
It
went.
was great.
Fred Foy. And but I do agree. And I read somebody wrote a book, and he had been a big politician, and he talked about Sergeant Preston. And he said how disappointing it was on TV. He was so ordinary looking, but on radio, and his dog, Yukon King, was, oh my gosh, you know. But that's it, imagination, yes.
Even children today, if you read the book
Right.
and then it's made into a movie, they say it's not at all as good as and I would thought
Never
that,
is, yeah.
no, they don't like it as well.
Yeah.
I remember saying that Sergeant Preston would say to King after the show was over, "Thanks to you, King, this case is closed."
Yeah, and that the dog got played up
Oh, yeah.
bigger and bigger.
He's a guy.
Yeah.
Hey, how
Ted
about
Johnstone.
remembering,
Go
how
ahead.
about remembering, would you like to be queen for a day?
Queen for a day.
What was the one item that every winner wanted? It was during World War II.
What was it? I don't know.
Tires for their cars. Because their husbands were on other sides of the country.
Sure.
And the tires, there was a huge tire shortage.
I didn't know they even made new tires during the war.
But
Shortage
they were
of rubber.
supplied by Firestone for the show.
The reason there was gas rationing during World War II wasn't so much as to conserve gasoline, it was to conserve rubber.
Actually, no, I'm thinking about this. They would have had to have made some tires for Jeeps for military vehicles during the war. So, yes.
Yeah, you were mentioning a mutual network at a baseball game of the week. So if they were broadcasting the Los Angeles baseball game, could somebody receive that in New York?
Oh yeah, it was on the network.
Uh-huh.
So the mutual announcers were at the game, and it was fed out to their hundreds of stations on the network.
Would that be fed over a landline?
In those days, it was. It was all by. In fact, I'm old enough that when I was on WGHQ and we used to do the Kingston High School football games, I had a microphone with a wire to a box, and the wire went to the telephone, landlines as they call it, and it went over a telephone line. And that's how it went. It was over TV, over a telephone line, hard line as they call it. Yeah. Now today they tell me, I don't know, but today they tell me they do the game, I don't have one, but they do the games on little cell phones now. If you could have seen the box we used to have to set up, and half the time we couldn't find the wire. The phone company come in, and WGHQ, WKY, WHUC, they would spend a lot of money with AT&T renting this line, and it would be out in the woods. We'd be searching all where's the line. And one time, the athletic director of Hudson High. This isn't a very tasteful story, but we weren't going to go on the air. And Jimmy Hogan, the AD, comes running up to me and says, "Ron, I found your wire. I had to go out in the woods because I had to pee so bad and I tripped over your wire." So that's how we got on the air that day, because the AD had to pee. My gosh. Otherwise, we'd have never got on the air. Yeah,
Well,
but yes.
I want to thank Ron for a wonderful talk tonight, and we have some refreshments out back for everybody. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
We really enjoyed this.